The old scientist wiped sweat from his forehead as he adjusted the massive radio telescope one more time. At 67 years old, Dr. Harrison had spent most of his life looking up at the stars, wondering what secrets they held. Night felt different, though, as the readings on his equipment were showing patterns he had never seen before. His small research station sat alone in the New Mexico desert, miles away from the nearest town. Most people thought he was crazy for choosing such an isolated place to conduct his final research project. But Harrison loved the silence. Here, away from all the noise of city life, he could focus on the mysterious signals coming from deep space. The old man had been working since sunset, tracking an unusual pattern of radio waves that seemed to be getting stronger by the hour. His weathered hands moved across the control panel with the skill of someone who had done this work for decades. Every few minutes, he would pause to sip coffee from a thermos that had seen better days suddenly. The equipment started beeping. Frantically. Harrison leaned forward, his tired eyes widening as he watched the reading spike beyond anything he had ever recorded. The signals were not random anymore. They had a structure, a purpose. It was as if something was trying to communicate. Grabbed his notebook and started scribbling down numbers, his excitement growing with each passing second. This was it. This was the discovery he'd been hoping for his entire career. But before he could finish writing, something made him look up at the night sky. What he saw made his pen fall from his trembling fingers. A soft blue light was descending. From the stars, moving in complete silence. It was not like any aircraft he had ever seen. The object was smooth and oval-shaped, glowing with an inner light that seemed to pulse gently like a heartbeat. As it came closer to the ground, Harrison could see it was about the size of a small house. The old scientist stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. All his years of searching for signs of life beyond Earth had not prepared him for this moment. His heart was beating so fast he could hear it in his ears. The mysterious craft landed softly about 50 yards from his research station. No sound at all. The blue glow faded, and for a moment, everything was perfectly quiet. Harrison could only hear his own breathing and the distant hum of his equipment. Then, a section of the craft opened like a flower blooming, and a figure stepped out, even in the dim starlight. Harrison could see that this being was unlike anything from Earth. She walked upright like a human, but her skin seemed to glow with a faint silvery light. She was tall and graceful, moving with a fluid motion that seemed almost like dancing. Her eyes were larger than human eyes, and they reflected the starlight like mirrors. The being approached slowly, her hands visible and empty, as if she understood that sudden movements might frighten him. Harrison wanted to run, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. His scientific mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening, while another part of him simply marveled at the impossible beauty of this moment. When she was about 10 feet away, the being stopped and spoke. Her voice was soft and musical, but the words were in perfect English. "Please do not be afraid," she said, her tone gentle and reassuring. "I have traveled very far to find you, Dr. Harrison. My name is Lyra, and I need your help." The old man's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. You know my name? You speak English?" Lyra nodded, a gesture that seemed surprisingly human. "We have been listening to your world's broadcasts for many years. We have learned your languages and studied your people. You are known among my kind as someone who seeks truth and understanding." Harrison felt his legs give way, and he sat down heavily on a nearby chair. This was beyond anything he had ever imagined. "Your kind? How many of you are there? Where do you come from?" "I come from a world that circles a star you call Kepler 442, Lyra explained, her glowing eyes never leaving his face. "My people have watched Earth for generations, but we have never made contact before. We had no reason to, until now." The sadness in her voice was unmistakable, even though she was from another world. Harrison found himself leaning forward, his scientific curiosity overcoming his fear. "What's wrong? Why do you need help?" Lyra looked up at the stars, and Harrison could see what looked like tears forming in her large eyes. "Our world is dying, Dr. Harrison. We have made terrible mistakes, and now we are running out of time. Our scientists have tried everything they can think of, but nothing works. We need something that we do not have. What could I possibly offer that your advanced civilization doesn't already possess? Harrison asked, genuinely puzzled. Lyra turned back to him, and her expression was filled with something he recognized despite their differences. It was hope mixed with desperation. You have something we lost long ago in our pursuit of logic and efficiency. You have wisdom that comes from making difficult choices. You have what you call courage. The old scientist shook his head in confusion. I don't understand. Surely your technology is far beyond ours. How could an old man like me help save an entire world? Lyra said, stepping closer. Sometimes the most advanced technology cannot solve the problems that require a heart willing to sacrifice for others. We have studied your history, Dr. Harrison. We know about the choices you made when you left your profitable job to pursue pure research, even though it meant financial hardship for your family. Harrison was stunned. How could she know about decisions he had made decades ago? You've been watching me, not just you, Lyra replied. We have been studying humans who demonstrate what you call moral courage, but you are special. Your combination of scientific knowledge and ethical strength is exactly what we need. The old man stood up slowly, his mind reeling with the implications of what she was telling him. An entire civilization was in trouble, and somehow they thought he could help. It seemed impossible, yet here was proof that the impossible could happen. What exactly do you need me to do? He asked. Lyra's expression became even more serious. I need you to teach me how humans make the kind of choices that can save worlds, even when the outcome is uncertain. I need you to show me your strength, not of body, but of spirit. As Harrison looked into her alien yet oddly familiar eyes, he realized that his quiet life of research was about to change forever. The greatest discovery of his career was not going to be about radio signals or distant stars. It was going to be about the connections that could exist between two very different forms of life, united by the universal challenge of doing what is right when everything seems lost. The next morning, Harrison sat across from Lyra in his small research cabin, still struggling to believe that the previous night had actually happened. She had stayed the entire night, explaining more about her world and her people. The alien woman seemed fascinated by the simplest things, the way Harrison made coffee, how he organized his research notes, even the photographs on his desk showing his grandchildren. On my world, we make all decisions together, Lyra explained, her glowing fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. Every choice goes through what you might call committees. We analyze data, run calculations, and pick the option that our computers say has the highest chance of success. Harrison poured himself another cup of coffee, his third since dawn. His old hands were steadier now, though his mind was still racing with questions. That sounds very organized. It's very logical. Yes, but it is also our weakness, Lyra said sadly. When our planet began to die, we followed the same process. Our greatest minds worked for years, creating solutions that looked perfect on paper. But every time we tried to fix one problem, we created two more. The old scientist leaned back in his chair, studying the beautiful alien woman across from him. Despite her otherworldly appearance, there was something deeply familiar about the pain in her eyes. It was the same look he had seen in the mirror during his own darkest moments. Tell me about your world, Harrison said gently. What went wrong? Lyra closed her large eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they seemed to shimmer with unshed tears. We became too successful, Dr. Harrison. Our technology advanced so quickly that we thought we could control everything. We changed. Our weather redirected our rivers and modified our soil to grow more food. For 1,000 years it worked perfectly. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the vast desert landscape. But we forgot something important. Forgot that nature has its own wisdom, its own balance. When that balance finally broke, it happened all at once. Our skies turned red, our oceans became poisonous, and our crops began to fail. Harrison felt a chill run down his spine.
How long do you have?
Our scientists estimate for months before Complete ecological collapse, Lyra replied, her voice barely above a whisper, maybe less. The weight of her words settled over the small cabin like a heavy blanket. Harrison had spent his entire career thinking about the vastness of space and the possibility of other civilizations, but he had never imagined being asked to help save one. "What makes you think I can help?" he asked finally. "I'm just one old man with more questions than answers." Lyra turned back to him, and for the first time since arriving, she smiled. It was a sad smile, but genuine, because you understand something my people have forgotten. You know how to make choices when you cannot see all the outcomes. She walked back to the table and sat down, leaning forward with obvious urgency. "Let me tell you about your decision 23 years ago. You were working for a large corporation. It's developing new ways to extract energy from the earth. The pay was excellent. Your family was comfortable, and your future seemed secure." Harrison nodded slowly, wondering how she could know such specific details about his past. "But then you discovered that your research could be used to create weapons," Lyra continued. "Weapons that could damage entire ecosystems. Your supervisors told you not to worry about such possibilities. They said it was not your responsibility what others did with your discoveries." The old man's coffee cup trembled slightly in his hands as the memories came flooding back. Those had been some of the hardest months of his life. "How could you possibly know about that?" "We have been studying your species for many years," Lyra explained. "We look for individuals who make choices based on principles rather than personal gain." "What you did next amazed our observers." Harrison remembered those sleepless nights, pacing the floor of his home while his wife slept. The decision that would change everything. "I quit. I walked away from everything." "Yes, and you gave up your salary, your security, and your comfortable life to pursue research that might never make you famous or wealthy. Your own family thought you had lost your mind." Lyra reached across the table and gently touched Harrison's weathered hand. Her skin was warm, despite its strange glow. "But you chose to follow what humans call conscience, even though you could not predict how things would turn out. That is the kind of strength my people need to learn," Harrison felt, tears forming in his own eyes as he remembered those difficult years that followed his decision. It wasn't easy. There were times when I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. My children had to work extra jobs to pay for school. My wife had to take on more hours at her job. "But you never went back," Lyra said softly. "Even when the company offered to double your salary and promised you could work on safer projects. You stayed true to your decision." The old scientist nodded, feeling the weight of those old choices settling on his shoulders again. "I had to live with myself. I knew that if I went back, every time I looked in the mirror, I would see someone who chose money over doing what was right." Lyra's eyes brightened with something that looked like hope. "That is exactly what we need to understand. How do you live with uncertainty? How do you make choices when you cannot calculate all the risks? How do you find the courage to sacrifice for principles that might not even save you?" Harrison stood up and walked to his desk, picking up a faded photograph of his family. "You don't find courage," he said quietly. "Courage finds you when you realize that some things are more important than your own comfort or safety." "My people have forgotten this wisdom," Lyra said, rising to join him at the desk. "We became so focused on avoiding risk that we stopped taking the chances necessary for real solutions. Every option our committees consider must be guaranteed to work. But the problems facing our world require us to act on faith, to trust in outcomes we cannot predict." Harrison turned to look at her, seeing not an alien being but a person desperately trying to save everything she loved. "What do you need me to do?" Lyra's expression became more serious than ever. "I need you to help me understand how to lead my people into uncertainty. How to convince them to try solutions that might fail. How to show them that sometimes the greatest strength comes from admitting you do not have all the answers." As Harrison looked into her alien yet deeply human eyes, he realized that the challenge before them was bigger than saving one world. It was about bridging the gap between two completely different ways of thinking and finding common ground in the universal struggle between safety and courage. For the next 3 days, Harrison and Lyra spent hours talking under the vast desert sky. The old scientist found himself becoming a teacher in ways he had never expected. They would sit by his equipment during the day, sharing stories and ideas, while the alien woman asked endless questions about human nature and decision-making. "Tell me about fear," Lyra said, on the second morning, watching Harrison adjust his radio telescope. "My people eliminated fear from our society long ago. We saw it as inefficient, something that clouded logical thinking." Harrison paused in his work and looked at her with surprise. "You don't feel fear? Ever?" "Not in the way humans do, she replied, her glowing skin reflecting the morning sunlight. "When we face danger, our minds simply calculate the best response. There is no emotional reaction, no racing hearts or sweating palms. We thought this made us superior." The old man sat down on a nearby rock, wiping his hands on a dusty towel. "Fear isn't always a bad thing, Lyra. Sometimes it's what keeps us alive. But more importantly, courage only exists when fear is present. You can't be brave if you're not afraid." Lyra tilted her head, a gesture Harrison had noticed she made when trying to understand something completely foreign to her experience. "Explain." "This to me," Harrison thought for a moment, then pointed to a story he had been telling her the day before. "Remember when I told you about the fire chief who ran into the burning building to save those children? He was terrified. His hands were shaking, his heart was pounding, and every instinct told him to stay outside where it was safe. But he went in anyway," Lyra said slowly. "Exactly. That's what made him a hero. Not the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it." Harrison picked up a small stone and turned it over in his weathered hands. If he hadn't been afraid, it would have just been a calculated risk. The fear made his choice meaningful. Lyra was quiet for a long time, staring out at the endless desert landscape. "On my world, when our leaders proposed the first environmental changes, there were some who felt what you might call doubt. But we dismissed these feelings as primitive responses that would interfere with optimal decision-making." "What happened to those people?" Harrison asked gently. "They were retrained," Lyra said, her voice growing sad. "We taught them to suppress these emotional responses and trust only in data and logical analysis. We believed we were helping them evolve beyond their limitations." Harrison felt a deep sadness wash over him as he began to understand the true tragedy of Lyra's people. You didn't just lose the ability to feel fear. You lost the ability to feel doubt, hesitation, and uncertainty. Those feelings that seem negative are actually what make us question our choices and consider other possibilities. "Yes," Lyra whispered. "And now, when we desperately need people who can think beyond pure logic, we have no one left who remembers." "How?" That afternoon, Harrison told her about his grandfather, a farmer who had lived through the great dust storms of the 1930s. He used to say that the smartest farmers weren't the ones with the most modern equipment or the biggest fields. They were the ones who could read the signs that couldn't be measured, the feel of the wind, the behavior of the animals, the subtle changes in the soil. But how could he trust such imprecise information? Lyra asked, genuinely puzzled. "Because he understood that some kinds of knowledge can't be reduced to numbers," Harrison explained. His grandfather had taught him, and his great-grandfather before that. Generations of farmers had learned to listen to things that scientific instruments couldn't detect. Lyra stood up and began pacing, something Harrison had noticed she did. When her mind was working through difficult concepts, "My people abandoned such traditional knowledge long ago. We said it was superstition, unreliable compared to our advanced sensors and computer models. Sometimes the old ways contain wisdom that we don't fully understand yet," Harrison said. "When I left my corporate job, I couldn't prove that I was making the right choice. I just knew, deep in my heart, that continuing that research would lead to something terrible." "How did you know?" Lyra asked, stopping her pacing to look directly at him. Harrison was quiet for a moment, searching for the right words. "It was like having a conversation with my future self. Imagine myself 10 years later, looking back at this moment. Every version of that future where I stayed with the company, I saw regret and shame. In the version where I left, I saw struggle and uncertainty, but also peace with my choice." "You made a decision based on an imaginary conversation?" Lyra seemed amazed by this concept. "In a way, yes. Humans often think through our choices by imagining different outcomes and how we would feel about them later. It's not scientific, but it helps us consider consequences that pure logic might miss. That evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the desert sky in brilliant colors, Lyra shared more about her world's crisis. Our committees have identified 17 different approaches to saving our planet. Each one has been thoroughly analyzed, and we know exactly what resources would be needed and what the probability of success would be. That sounds promising, Harrison said. The problem is that none of them have a high enough probability of success to meet our criteria for implementation, Lyra explained. Our standard requires a 95% certainty before we commit to any major action. The best plan our scientists have developed only has a 67% chance of working. Harrison nearly choked on his coffee. 67%? That's better odds than most of the important decisions humans make in life. Really? Lyra looked shocked. Absolutely. When I chose to marry my wife, I had no statistical analysis of our compatibility. When we decided to have children, we couldn't predict what kind of parents we would be or how our kids would turn out. Most of the choices that shaped my life were made with far less certainty than 67%. Lyra stared at him in amazement. How do you function with such uncertainty? Harrison smiled, thinking of all the wonderful unpredictability that had filled his life. You have something your people might have forgotten. You have hope. We believe that even when we can't control the outcome, making the attempt is better than doing nothing. But what if you fail? Lyra asked. Then we try something else, Harrison said simply. Failure isn't the end of the story for humans. It's just another chapter. Sometimes our best discoveries come from our biggest mistakes. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Lyra sat in thoughtful silence. Harrison could see that she was processing ideas that challenged everything her civilization had believed for generations. The old scientist realized that teaching her about human courage and decision-making was also teaching him something important about himself and his own species. Tomorrow, Lyra said finally, I want you to help me understand how to convince my people to try something that might not work. How do you give hope to those who have forgotten how to dream? Harrison looked up at the infinite stars above them and smiled. Now that's a question worth staying up all night to answer. On the fourth morning, everything changed. Harrison woke up to find Lyra standing outside his cabin, staring at a device in her hands that was flashing urgent red lights. Her usual calm expression had been replaced by something he had never seen before, what humans would recognize as panic. What's wrong? Harrison asked, rushing outside, still in his pajamas. I'm receiving emergency communications from my world, Lyra said, her voice tight with emotion. The situation has gotten much worse. Our atmospheric processors are failing. Faster than predicted, we might have weeks instead of months. Harrison felt his heart sink. Just when he thought he was beginning to help her understand human decision-making, time was running out. What are your people saying? Lyra's hands were actually trembling as she operated the device. The High Council has called an emergency session. They're debating whether to abandon our world entirely and search for a new planet to colonize, and the other option, to attempt a restoration plan with only 67% chance of success, she replied. But the debate has split our entire civilization. Half want to leave immediately and find safety elsewhere. The other half insists we need more time to develop a plan with better odds. Harrison sat down heavily on his front steps, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. While they're debating, your planet continues to die. Exactly, Lyra said, sitting beside him. This is exactly what you've been trying to teach me about. My people are so afraid of making the wrong choice that they're paralyzed. Meanwhile, every day we wait, more of our world becomes uninhabitable. The old scientist looked at her, seeing not an alien being, but someone facing the most difficult moment of her life. What do you want to do? Lyra was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert landscape that had become familiar to both of them over the past few days. I want to go back and convince them to try the restoration plan. But Harrison, I've never had to lead anyone before. On my world, leadership means facilitating group decisions, not making bold choices that others might oppose. Sometimes, Harrison said gently, real leadership means standing up and saying what needs to be said, even when people don't want to hear it. But what if I'm wrong? What if the plan fails and my people blame me for not choosing evacuation instead? Harrison smiled sadly, recognizing the fear in her voice as completely human despite her alien nature. That's the burden of leadership. Lyra, you have to be willing to accept responsibility for the outcome, whether it's success or failure. Suddenly, Lyra's device started making different sounds, and her expression grew even more troubled. There's something else. The Council wants me to return immediately, but they've also detected my ship's location. They know I'm on Earth. Is that a problem? It could be, Lyra said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. There are factions among my people who believe that contact with other civilizations should be forbidden. They think that learning from humans might contaminate our logical purity. Harrison felt a chill run down his spine. Odd. What would happen if they decided Earth was a threat? I don't know, Lyra admitted. My people have never faced such a decision before. But some of our more extremist groups might argue that sharing our location with Earth could endanger both our worlds. The old scientist stood up, pacing back and forth as he tried to process this new information. So you're asking me to help you save your world, but doing so might put my world at risk? Yes, Lyra said simply. And that decision, Harrison, is exactly the kind of choice you've been teaching me about. Acting on incomplete information when the stakes are impossibly high. Harrison stopped pacing and looked directly at her, in her large alien eyes. He saw the same struggle he had faced 23 years ago when he walked away from his corporate job. The same impossible choice between safety and doing what felt right. You want to know how humans make these decisions? He asked. Yes. We stop thinking about all the things that could go wrong, and we start focusing on what we know is right. Harrison sat back down beside her. I know that your people are facing extinction. I know that you came here seeking help, not to cause harm. And I know that sometimes, when everything seems hopeless, the only choice is to trust in something bigger than yourself. Lyra studied his weathered face with intense concentration. You're saying I should trust in hope rather than logic? I'm saying you should trust in both, Harrison replied. Use your logic to evaluate the plan, but use your heart to find the courage to implement it. But what about the risk to Earth? Harrison was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his children and grandchildren, about all the people who would be affected by his decision. Then he thought about Lyra's world, dying while its people debated in committees. Lyra, in all the time you've spent studying humans, what have you learned about us? That you're unpredictable, emotional, and often illogical, she said. And what else? That you're also capable of incredible kindness, even to strangers. That you'll sacrifice your own safety to help others. That you believe in things like justice and compassion, even when they're not efficient. Harrison nodded. Then you already know what kind of species we are. If your people are anything like you, I'm willing to take the risk that contact between our worlds will lead to something good rather than something terrible. Lyra's eyes filled with what looked like tears. You're willing to trust the future of your entire world to that belief? I'm willing to trust it to the same principles that brought you here in the first place, Harrison said. You came seeking wisdom to save your people? It tells me everything I need to know about your character and theirs. Lyra stood up and walked to her ship, then turned back to him. Will you come with me? Harrison felt his heart skip a beat. To your world. My people need to see what human courage looks like. They need to understand that the strength they're looking for isn't found in perfect plans or guaranteed outcomes. It's found in the willingness to act when action is needed, regardless of the risks. The old scientist looked at his research station, at the simple life he had built in the desert, at the familiar Earth sky above him. Then he looked at Lyra, representing an entire civilization that needed help he might be able to provide. When do we leave? He asked, as they prepared for a journey that would take him farther from home than any human had ever traveled. Harrison realized that this was the ultimate test of everything he had been teaching her. Now he would have to demonstrate that human courage wasn't just words and stories, but a willingness to step into the unknown when others were counting on you. The greatest adventure of his life was about to begin, and there were no guarantees, except the knowledge that sometimes doing the right thing was more important than doing the safe thing. The journey to Lyra's world took 3 days, though Harrison's body felt like it had been traveling for weeks. The inside of her ship was unlike anything he had ever imagined, walls that seemed to be made of flowing light and a gentle humming that made him feel strangely peaceful, despite his nervousness about what lay ahead. During the journey, Lyra taught him how to breathe in her world's thinner atmosphere and explained what he might expect when they arrived. "My people will be gathering in the Great Assembly," she said, as they approached her planet. "It's where all major decisions are made. There will be thousands of representatives from every region of our world." Harrison looked out at the approaching planet through what Lyra called a viewing portal. Even from space, he could see that something was terribly wrong. The oceans that should have been blue were a sickly green color, and the continents were covered in strange reddish clouds. "It's worse than I thought," Lyra whispered, seeing his expression. When they landed, Harrison was amazed by the alien city that stretched out before them. The buildings seemed to grow from the ground like crystal trees, reaching toward the sky in spirals and curves that defied everything he knew about construction. But even these beautiful structures couldn't hide the signs of environmental collapse. The air had a bitter taste. The light from their sun seemed dimmed by the toxic atmosphere. Lyra led him through streets filled with beings that looked similar to her, though their skin seemed less bright than hers, as if the dying world was draining the life from them. Many stopped to stare at Harrison with a mixture of curiosity and fear. He was clearly the first human they had ever seen. "Remember," Lyra said, as they approached a massive building that rose from the center of the city, "my people have never heard ideas like the ones you've shared with me. They may seem resistant at first." The Great Assembly was a sight that Harrison would never forget. Thousands of Lyra's people sat in perfect rows, their glowing forms creating a sea of soft light. In the enormous chamber, at the center, a group of what appeared to be leaders stood around a complex display showing charts, graphs, and calculations that Harrison couldn't begin to understand as Lyra and Harrison entered. A complete silence fell over the assembly. Every eye turned toward them, and Harrison could feel the weight of their attention like a physical force. His heart was pounding, but he reminded himself of all the conversations he'd had with Lyra about acting despite fear. One of the leaders, an elderly being with skin that sparkled like starlight, stepped forward. "Lyra of the Western Territories," he said, in a voice that echoed through the chamber. "You have violated our protocols by making contact with an alien species without council approval. And you have brought this ... creature to our sacred assembly." Lyra stood straighter. Harrison could see her drawing on the courage they had talked about during their long discussions in the desert. "Honored Elder Zephyr, I brought Dr. Harrison here because our world is dying while we debate. He represents something we have forgotten, the ability to act on wisdom rather than certainty." A murmur ran through the assembly, and Harrison could hear both excitement and disapproval in the voices. Elder Zephyr raised his hand for silence. "Our calculations show that the human's presence here has created 17 new variables that could affect our decision-making process. This complicates an already difficult situation." Harrison felt Lyra tense beside him, and he realized this was the moment when everything they had discussed would be put to the test. He stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, despite his nervousness. "Elder Zephyr, with respect, I think you're missing the point," Harrison said. "I'm not here to complicate your calculations. I'm here to suggest that maybe you're asking the wrong questions." The assembly erupted in shocked whispers. Apparently no one had ever interrupted an elder before. But Harrison continued, drawing on decades of experience explaining complex ideas to students and colleagues. "Tells me you have a plan that has a 67% chance of saving your world, but you won't try it because the odds aren't high enough. On my world, we have a saying, 'Perfect is the enemy of good.' While you're searching for the perfect solution, your planet is dying." Elder Zephyr's expression was unreadable. "And what would you have us do, human? Risk the lives of our entire civilization on uncertain odds?" "What if you risk your lives on hope?" Harrison replied. "Because the alternative is certain death. When my people face impossible choices, we don't just calculate probabilities. We ask ourselves, what legacy do we want to leave? What kind of people do we want to be remembered as?" He looked around the assembly, seeing thousands of faces reflecting the same fear and uncertainty that he had seen in humans throughout history. You can be remembered as the civilization that had every tool needed to save themselves but chose paralysis over action. Or you can be remembered as the people who took a leap of faith when everything seemed hopeless. Lyra stepped beside him, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. Dr. Harrison has taught me something important. Isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite fear. We are all afraid of what might happen if our restoration plan fails. But we should be more afraid of what will definitely happen if we do nothing. She turned to address the entire assembly. I have learned from humans that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes not from our computers or our calculations, but from our hearts. Our ancestors took risks to build this civilization. Now it's our turn to take risks to save it. Elder Zephyr was quiet for a long moment, his ancient eyes moving between Harrison and Lyra. Finally, he spoke. The human speaks of legacy and courage. These are concepts our people once understood before we became so focused on efficiency and certainty. He turned to the assembly. Perhaps it is time to remember that our greatest achievements came not from perfect plans, but from bold action guided by hope and determination. The debate that followed lasted for hours, but Harrison could sense that something fundamental had shifted in the chamber. Lyra's people began talking not just about probabilities and calculations, but about values and dreams, and the kind of future they wanted to create. When the vote was finally taken, the restoration plan was approved by a significant majority. As the assembly dispersed to begin the massive effort of implementing the plan, Elder Zephyr approached Harrison. You have given us a great gift, the elder said. You've reminded us that we are more than the sum of our calculations. We are beings capable of hope, courage, and choice. 6 months later, Harrison stood again in the great assembly, but this time the atmosphere was filled with celebration. The restoration plan had worked, not perfectly and not without setbacks, but it had worked. The oceans were clearing, the toxic clouds were dissipating, and life was returning to Lyra's world. You see, Lyra said, standing beside him as they watched the joyful celebration around them. Sometimes 67% is enough when it's combined with 100% commitment. Harrison smiled, thinking about the long journey that had brought him here. The strongest thing about humans isn't our technology or our intelligence, he said. It's our willingness to believe that tomorrow can be better than today, even when we can't prove it. As he prepared to return to Earth, Harrison realized that his greatest discovery had nothing to do with radio signals or alien civilizations. It was the understanding that courage, hope, and the willingness to act on principle were truly universal qualities that could bridge any gap between worlds. The old scientist had found his strength, and doing so had helped an entire civilization rediscover theirs.